Hey guys, John here from FlyMikeAlpha.com. Today we're going to be going over one of my favorite topics, cockpit resource management. So we're going to go ahead and take you through what that really means, how it's applied, and all the tips and tricks of how to apply it and bring it into your cockpit. So cockpit resource management, CRM. What we're going to be talking about today is CRM in the terms of you flying with another pilot, or you flying with other people in your airplane, maybe just you're the only pilot. We're going to save single pilot resource management for when you're totally the only pilot and the only occupant of the aircraft, because there's a lot more we can talk about that's specific to SRM when you're the only occupant in the aircraft, and a lot of GA flights happen with only one person on board. So a little bit of background on CRM. Back in the day, on the left here, we got our captain, who back in the day, he made all the decisions. It was really just what the captain says went. That was how it is. Now today, we look at the flight crew all as one unit. So you have the captain combined with the FO, flight attendants, and everyone on board that makes up the crew, and you utilize all those resources appropriately. Of course, the captain is still the final authority and makes the decisions, but he really incorporates everyone else into that decision-making process so that the best decisions are made. So cockpit resource management, as we know it, includes aeronautical decision-making, the decisions you make based on your flying and what you're deciding in the air. Risk management, so managing all the risks that come your way before flying, while flying, and after. And task management. So how do you manage all those tasks that pop up while you're in the air, whether it be leaning the mixture, talking to air traffic control, navigating, flying, planning your next fuel stop, and so on. Automation management is certainly a big part of today's cockpit resource management because a lot of our cockpits have some sort of automation, whether it be a wing leveler, a full 3-axis autopilot, or some sort of FMS system. CFIT awareness goes into cockpit resource management, managing all your resources possible to avoid CFIT, controlled flight into terrain. That's a really bad thing when you fly your airplane into terrain, especially when it's controlled into terrain. Basically, you're the one doing it. It's not any fault of the airplane. And that is still a common cause of aircraft accidents that we're trying to cut back on. Lastly, situational awareness. So how do you increase situational awareness through cockpit resource management? We're going to go ahead and touch on all these as we go through our presentation today. One thing I want to note here is that the FAA does have an entire handbook dedicated towards risk management. So that's an excellent read. Also, if you just check out the regular old Pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge, that has a great section on SRM and CRM as well, and all the different models that go along with that. So you have recognizing hazards, internal resources, external resources, the 5P check, decide model, and one of my favorites, the OODA Loop model. Now we're going to talk a lot about the 5P check in a little bit here, so I just want to quickly cover the decide model and the OODA Loop model with you, so you have a little bit of information on that. So the decide model ultimately is an acronym for 6 activities that you're going to do when you have a problem arise. So the first one is define the problem. So define or detect, let's say the oil pressure gauge is reading a little low, so we have to first detect that it is, see it, and then define that. So oil pressure is a little bit low. Next, estimate, the need to react. Estimate what that means. Well, to estimate it properly, you're going to have to look at things like oil temperature. Is oil temperature running a little hot? Then if oil temperature is running a little hot and oil pressure is low, that's an indication that the engine is getting low on oil, and you need to immediately choose a course of action. Once you choose a course of action, something like, hey, declare an emergency and land at the nearest suitable airport, that would be a good course of action to choose. So you choose that action and then identify the solutions. What can you do to fix that? Well, not a whole heck of a lot. You can try, if you have an airport very close by, to enrich in the mixture, try to cool down the engine that way, reduce power, cool the engine that way. Obviously, if the airport's farther away, you're going to have to keep your power up, but I would say in that scenario, richen up the mixture. That'd be your best way to cool the engine down. If you have cowl flaps, you could open them, but there's a limited number of things you can really do if you're running out of oil. You can't exactly reach around the cowling and fill it back up with oil while you're in flight. So limited number of solutions there to identify. Next thing is do the necessary action. So the necessary action we identified was land at the nearest suitable airport. So do that. Point the nose in that direction, start flying towards that airport, get set up for it, and then evaluate the effect of the action. Well, Evaluate how close you're getting. Evaluate if you're going to make it before the engine seizes up. Is it still running okay? Is it starting to run rough and RPM falling off and you're starting to lose power or manifold pressure is dropping? If that's the case, then evaluate maybe that's not going to work out and you need to run this model again. Now the problem becomes engine failure. Estimate the need to react. Well, immediately. Choose a course of action. Land in a field because you're not going to make it to the airport. Identify the solutions. Well, all you can do now is prepare for the emergency landing, secure the engine, and then do that, execute the emergency landing, and then evaluate how that went. Provided that the airplane's still in one piece, once you land in that field, you can then evaluate how well you did in your landing and figure out what you're going to do next. Call on your cell phone for somebody to come pick you up, or radio back to ATC that you made it, but you still need assistance, or maybe you're upside down in a ditch and things aren't so hot and you need medical attention and you need to try to establish communication. But these models, whether it's Decide, OODA Loop, or 5P, they all run continuously. It's not a one and done thing. You're continuously running these models. And that's the Decide model. Really nice model. I like it. You can get a little hard card printed out and stick it somewhere in your flight deck or in your cockpit and just stick it to your visor or something so you can help yourself run through that when you encounter problems in the air. Next, we'll go over the OODA Loop model. That's my particular favorite just because it's a little bit briefer, and the OODA Loop model is a little bit more concise, but it's also what they use to teach law enforcement dealing with threats and high threat situations, so it's going to be a little bit more concise, a little bit quicker way. So when you have a serious threat, you want to observe, orient, decide, and act. So let's take a look at that same situation with the low oil pressure gauge. Observe. Well, you notice the oil pressure is low. Orient yourself. Scan the rest of the panel. Look at the windscreen. Is there oil coming out of the engine? Does it smell funny? Is the oil temperature running hot? Then, based off of all that, decide. Decide what you're going to do. Are you going to continue the flight, or did you notice oil on the windscreen and the oil temperature increasing? That's signs of low oil level and the engine running out of oil. So now we need to decide to land. Lastly, act. Land the airplane. So, a little bit simpler, a little bit more concise, depending on the amount of time you have to deal with things. You could use either model. Now, it's important to note, OODA Loop is a loop. It's continuously ongoing. So we observed low oil pressure, we oriented ourselves to the situation, we decided to land, we acted by turning the airplane towards an airport, but it's a loop. Now we need to observe again. Are we approaching the airport? Is it going to work out? Are we coming in the right direction? Orient ourselves. Let's get set up on a downwind. Let's figure out if there's any traffic in the pattern. Let's figure out if there's a control tower we need to talk to. Let's talk to ATC, let them know what our situation is, decide what we're going to be doing, and then act upon that decision. And it continuously goes and goes and goes and goes. So I do like that model, but that's just a personal preference. Any of these work, and as always, stick with what the FAA recommends. Now let's talk about passengers for a minute here as it relates to CRM. Passengers are kind of a pain in the butt. They can be great, can be not so much, but typically they can be a little bit of a pain. So the first thing you want to do when you have passengers in a little airplane, they're probably flown on bigger airplanes before like the airlines, you need to set their expectations. Little airplanes are not 747s. They don't have the same comforts, they don't have the same characteristics, and there are a lot more responsibilities placed upon the passenger when they're flying in a small aircraft and you're the pilot. So you need to set those passenger expectations right when they get on the airplane. Great way to do this is a passenger safety briefing when they get on. Of course, you're required to tell them how their seatbelt works and how the door functions, but you should go above and beyond that and let them know what kind of weather to expect en route. What sort of things are going to be happening. You're going to taxi out, you're going to rev up the engine, do a run-up. They probably have no idea why you're revving up the engine and not going anywhere and why that engine's kind of stumbling as you do a mag check. So explain those things to them. Set their expectations at the proper level. The best way to do that is a pre-flight brief. Make sure you include safety items on that pre-flight brief and also include sterile cockpit when they need to not talk so that you can focus on flying the airplane. Then you also can give them jobs to do. You can do this on the ground. It's best to brief them on it and then remind them in the air and assign more jobs to them. Things like, one of my favorite is, hey, I'll buy you a beer if you spot an airplane that I don't see. So if you see an airplane that's within 1 mile of us and you call it out before I do, I'll buy you a beer. That keeps them looking out the window and help you to look for other airplanes and traffic conflicts. So they become a great traffic searcher at that point. Tell them you'll buy them a beer if they notice any gauges that are out of the green during flight. So they are also scanning the panel Well, you're busy talking to ATC and doing other things where you might not be scanning the panel as quickly or as often as you need to be. Traffic lookout is one of my favorites. Chart holder, hey, if you're fumbling with a sectional chart, just hand it to them. Hey, hold this. That's a great way to have them hold it to the right page and hold it right at the right angle so that you can read it while you're still flying the airplane. Make them a checklist reader. You don't have to be a pilot or an expert in aviation to just read a piece of paper. So when you want to do a cruise checklist or a descent checklist, rather than staring down at the checklist and not looking out the window and not flying the airplane, have them read the checklist to you, hear it, act upon it, and then move on. So that is a great way to keep your attention focused where it needs to be. Another one is zookeeper. That's one of my favorites. When you have a zoo in back, i.e. dogs, cats, children, make them the zookeeper. Make them take care of all that other stuff so that you're just like an airline pilot with a nice heavy-duty bulletproof door behind you, and you can ignore everything else that's going on in the back seat, and it doesn't distract you. If you ever think back to having children in the back seat of your car and you having to drive down the highway and reach behind you to slap them upside the head, it distracts you from driving and makes you swerve a little bit. That's a really bad thing to do in an airplane. Make sure you have a zookeeper to slap your children upside the head when they act up. Next way to manage your cockpit, your resources, maybe bring some additional resources into the cockpit, like tablet apps. They're awesome for weather, for traffic, for flight planning, for navigation, all sorts of different things you can do for fuel calculations, time en route. All these different items can be done on these iPads or Android tablet or whatever flavor you prefer with all sorts of different apps. Flight and Garmin Pilot are two of my favorites, and they are really, really, really powerful apps. Just make sure you're using them appropriately. Again, maybe have one of your passengers or your other pilot hold on to it. If you have another pilot that's familiar with the app, make them run the app and just give you the information that it's relaying to you so you're not distracted by it. Also, make sure you're totally familiar with all the functions of the app, because there's a lot of things that these apps can do. You don't want to get stuck in some weird section of the app or some weird page that you're not quite sure of, or messing up settings and not know how to change them back while you're actually flying. So be totally familiar with it, and don't just download a new app and then go fly and try to get familiar with it as you're trying to fly the airplane, especially if you're by yourself. Have somebody drive you in a car, sit in the passenger seat of the car, go down the road, and then play with the app. So that actually gives you the whole GPS function, the maneuvering, and all that sort of thing, and actually shows you how the app's going to work when you're flying, how to calculate different time en route, distances, things like that, before you actually get into an airplane and the workload increases tenfold. Also consider investing in a nice sturdy tablet holder, whether it's yoke mounted or window mounted. I prefer the window mounted ones. I don't need any more stuff clamped onto my yoke. Maybe a cell phone's fine, but anything like a tablet gets to be a little bit too heavy clamped onto that yoke there when you're flying light airplanes. Next, we have autopilot systems, autoflight systems. So lots of different modes and flavors these things come in. Anything from just a regular old wing leveler to a 3-axis autopilot that's going to control your rudder, ailerons, and elevator for you. Now, there's a lot of different modes these function in too, whether it be navigation mode, relaying info from an iPad or from a Garmin 430 or something like that. It's panel mounted. It could just be off of a heading. It could be off of a VOR. So be very familiar with your autopilot system and use it, but use it sparingly. Of course, in long cruise flight, absolutely turn the autopilot on. Be very familiar with how it works and what sort of situations you want to be running it in. Say you're a VFR pilot that inadvertently flies into IMC. Well, that's a great time to reach over and press the level button on your FMC, your flight management computer, and just go ahead and have the airplane level itself so you don't get turned around while you then select a heading with your heading bug 180 degrees and then pop it into heading mode and let the airplane turn by itself in a nice 20-degree bank back towards the heading that you want it on. So that's a great idea, except for maybe you're an instrument pilot that flies into IMC and you have a vacuum pump failure. So you decide to throw on wing leveler mode because you're having a hard time figuring out which way's up now that your attitude indicator and your DG are both not functioning. Trouble is, some of these older autopilots work off of vacuum. And so if you've lost your vacuum pump, the gyro inside your autopilot is also losing speed and is also unreliable. And if you throw on wing leveler mode, it will give you something that is not level, I promise you. It will not be good. And by the time you realize it, it's probably going to be a little too late for you to fix that scenario. You'll already be in a graveyard spiral, which is really, really bad. So Be very familiar with your autopilot system, just like you have to be familiar with your passengers and who you're flying with, and know their capabilities, as well as the capabilities of your aircraft and its equipment.
Oh my God, the automatic pilot, it's deflating!
Well, wait, don't panic. On the belt line of the automatic pilot, there is a hollow tube. Now that is the manual inflation nozzle. Pull it out and blow on it.
What the hell's going on up there?
Practice with all of the modes. Way too many people get comfortable with like nav mode and heading mode, but never try using wing leveler mode or roll mode or anything like that. Or using flight level change mode, indicate airspeed mode. There's all sorts of different modes that come on all different flavors of these autopilots. Be familiar with all of them in VMC conditions with a safety pilot. Maybe go up with a CFI that's familiar with it to show you all those different modes before you get into bad weather and have to try to figure it out then. Don't neglect hand flying either. Don't just kick the autopilot on at 500 feet after takeoff and kick it off 500 feet before landing. Although it's super nice and easy to get used to that, you want to keep your hand flying skills up. It is a very quickly deteriorating skill. Much more than driving a car or riding a bike, hand flying skills deteriorate very rapidly, and you want to keep them up and sharp so that when it does break, or when you get into a situation where you need to hand fly the airplane, you're able to do so effectively. Now, your airport and route info. Use the resources you have. Use ATC. Use 1-800 weather briefing or flight services. Use your passengers to help you read the map, or another pilot on board to help you read the map and navigate. Use the iPad apps. Use online sources like SkyVector. Use weather apps. Use all of the tools at your disposal, and especially don't neglect the chart supplement, the old AFD, that has so much awesome information about airports in it, and it's pretty concise. Brings it in a nice short format, and really helpful things like, hey, when does that tower open and close? When do you actually have to contact them versus when is it just Class Echo airspace? You can fly right on in. Make sure you're really keeping up to date on TFRs, NOTAMs, and all those sorts of things, and use the resources you have. Use SkyVector, use 1-800 Weather Brief, use ATC to make sure that you're not getting into trouble from a TFR or a NOTAM, like, hey, the airport's closed, or the runway's closed, or this taxiway's been closed. Now, CRM and the 5P check, I said we'd get back into this. And so the 5P check is to plan, the plane, pilot, passengers, and programming. So that's what the FAA really likes to hear, those 5 Ps. Come up with a good plan for your flight and for the entire day. Make sure the plane is good to go. Do a thorough pre-flight. Check the maintenance logs. Take it on a little test flight maybe before you load it up with people. Pilot, make sure you're good to go. Use those checklists like I'm safe to make sure that you yourself are ready to go flying. Passengers, make sure they're well briefed. Make sure they're not going to be a huge distraction. Passengers are always a distraction. Make sure they're not going to be a huge distraction for you. Mitigate that risk. Do it with pre-flight briefings. Make sure you're not taking, 3 kids and yourself in a 172. Make sure you're taking 2 kids and another adult to be the zookeeper, to keep them in line while you're flying the airplane. Programming. Make sure that everything is programmed properly. Be familiar with the automation on your airplane. Way too many people get confused with flight plans on Garmin 430s or your iPad or whatever navigation instrument you're using. And that automation, that technology becomes more of a distraction and more detrimental to you flying the airplane than a help. So be very familiar with the programming on the airplane, that everything is programmed properly, or worst case scenario, just click, 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 click. Knock off all the automation, hand fly the airplane, just fly the airplane. That is always going to be your default, just fly the airplane. Now, what kind of pre-flight resources do you have in the 5 Ps? Well, you have ATC, you have weather briefing, you have all sorts of technology on the internet available to you. Use all those resources. Just prior to takeoff, 5 Ps, well, weather's really bad. So think about your plan. Think about your plane, what it's capable of. Think about the programming. Do you need to reprogram a different route in? Think about your passengers. Are they ready to go fly through bad weather? Maybe you are. Maybe you're a highly skilled IFR pilot, but your passengers are not ready to get bounced around on the ride of their lives. think about all that before you go take off into that weather. You can still decide to cancel or delay when you're on the ground. There's no such thing as an emergency takeoff. There's plenty of emergency landings. I've seen plenty. I've had some myself. There's no such thing as an emergency takeoff. You don't have to take off. If you find yourself in a scenario where you need an emergency takeoff, that's not good. There's some other things that have gone wrong besides the flying. It could be any one of the 5 Ps that requires a change or a decision. Or change to a decision that you've made. So any of those 5 Ps can affect you all the way from, hey, it's a great day, to just one of those Ps being out of line and you saying, okay, no, we're not going to go fly today. Remember, it's always better to be on the ground wishing you were flying than flying wishing you were on the ground. I've been in those scenarios. They're not fun. The in-flight midpoint. Destination, weather, airport NOTAMs. You should have already checked all that stuff before you took off. But once you get to your midpoint of flight, or if it's a really short flight, even earlier than the midpoint, start re-examining all those and double-checking them. Maybe weather's changed at the destination. Maybe somebody's had an accident there and landed gear up and they've shut down a runway. There's a NOTAM out for it now. Maybe the airport has just become way busier than you expected. You listen to the CTAF and you hear 25 different airplanes in the pattern, and that's just a little bit above your comfort level for flying into a non-towered airport. You hear guys stepping on each other all over the frequency. It's just a whole big mess. And you decide, hey, we're going to land somewhere else or turn around and go get lunch somewhere else today. Pilot and passenger fatigue, physical needs, hypoxia. So again, stuff that you would have been thinking about before you took off, but at the midpoint, reevaluate these. Reevaluate these several points throughout the flight. Are you getting tired? Are you getting hungry? Is your blood sugar getting low? Are you thirsty? You're going to become thirstier faster when you're flying because you're exposed to the sun, you're exposed to drier air, and there's less pressure on you. So you're going to need a little bit more water than usual, which means you're probably going to need to go to the bathroom a little bit more than usual as well. Hypoxia. Are you flying too high? Are you getting a little bit blue in the fingertips or lips? Are your passengers acting a little funny? Best way to handle this is just carry a little pulse ox with you so that you're not just trying to guess of how blue your fingertips are and compare them to the blue interior on your 1967 172. Carry a pulse ox and that can tell you exactly where you're at hypoxia-wise. Plane, equipment, problems, fuel, mechanicals, all those fun things that may change at the midpoint, especially if you're getting ready to do a water crossing, or if you're just going to be flying away from other airports, away from civilization for a little while. Make sure you're checking these. What kind of problems may occur? What kind of problems have occurred since takeoff that you haven't detected yet? Is fuel on par with where it's supposed to be? You may have plenty of fuel in the tanks, but you plan to land with half tanks and you're already down to half tanks. That's still plenty of fuel. But if you're halfway through the flight and you've burned a lot more than you had expected, that's an issue that needs addressing. Any mechanicals out of line, make sure you're scanning that panel, looking at everything that's telling you how your engines are doing, how your airplane's doing as you're flying along. The 5 Ps for descent and landing. What if things change? What if I have to divert last minute? How are you going to handle those situations? Have a plan so that you don't get down low, do a go-around for bad weather, bad wind, something like that, and then go, oh man, now what I'm going to do now? I don't have a lot of gas, I'm burning into my reserves. Now what? Have a plan ahead of time. Always be thinking, what happens, what do I do if things change? What if my glide slope or primary nav fails? Are you going to be like on your instrument checkride where the guy says, hey, shoot an ILS and make sure you're timing it in case you lose the glide slope so then you can make it a localizer approach? Well, if I have navigational issues when I'm on an ILS, and the airplane is otherwise sound, I'm probably going to be going around and not trying to last minute convert this thing into a loc approach, miscalculate, and wind up flying my airplane into the ground or into a mountain. That's really easy to do when you're trying to juggle all those things and now switch from following a glide slope down to following timing from a final approach fix that you may or may not have properly identified. So really have a plan for what are you going to do if the glide slope or primary nav fails partway through the flight, or especially on the descent and landing phase when you're getting closer to the ground and closer to obstacles. What if a passenger on descent has an air blockage? How are you going to handle this, especially if you're low on fuel? Now, we could go, and we will in another video, check out on our videos tab on our channel, all the different scenarios for medical emergencies and things like aeromedical factors that come into play with yourself and your passengers. But just come up with a plan for what are you going to do if your passenger has an air blockage. We'll go into detail about that in another video. In summary here, CRM, Cockpit Resource Management. Have a plan. Have a plan before you take off. Have a plan in the air. Have a plan after you land. That plan will probably change several times, but continuously plan. One of my favorite quotes is Dwight D. Eisenhower in Preparing for Battle. I have always found that plans are useless, but planning is indispensable. That's very applicable to flying. Think about every time you go flying as you're going into battle, to battle the weather, the airplane, all those things trying to bring you down back to Earth. Well, you need to have a plan. It's probably useless, but it's the fact that you were planning, which is indispensable. You were thinking ahead of the game, and that is going to come into handy for when your plan becomes useless. Make sure you're delegating. Delegate. That's the hallmark of a good manager, right? And you're just a big manager up there. When you're a pilot in command, you are the manager, CEO of that airplane, and you need to delegate tasks. Now, who do you delegate to? Delegate to your passengers. Delegate to other pilots in your airplane. Delegate to other pilots outside of your airplane. You have an issue and you need somebody to look something up in a POH while you're wrestling with your airplane. Hit the button, and if you're flying a Cessna 172, I bet you somebody else on frequency is flying a Cessna 172 when you're talking to approach or center, and they might be able to help you. There might be a CFI on frequency that's able to help you. Delegate to ATC. Don't bother looking up in your iPad how long a runway is at an airport. If you're making an emergency landing, simply ask ATC to do it for you. Don't bother trying to call on 121.5 or call on Unicom to the FBO to tell them to have an ambulance there ready for you. Tell ATC to pick up the phone and have an ambulance waiting at the FBO for you. Simply delegate as much as you possibly can to as many people as you possibly can to decrease your workload so that your mind remains clear and you can think about what really matters and stick to what you're good at, flying the airplane and ultimately making the final decision on items. Next, use evaluation and decision models to help you. The 5 Ps, decide, OODA Loop, pave. Use those mnemonic checklists to help you process and come up with decisions. Make sure you're thinking outside the box. What's the best way if you're flying along at, say, 1,000 feet near an untowered airport and you have a passenger that's having a heart attack? Is it best to get on the CTAF when the FBO is closed and try to call somebody? Maybe somebody's going to hear you and call for an ambulance? Or is it best just to pull out your cell phone since you're at 1,000 feet, dial 911, Bluetooth it into your headset, and tell them exactly where you are, what you're doing, and then you need an ambulance to meet you at the airport? Think outside the box. You have a lot of tools available to you that you may not immediately recognize. So go ahead and have a little hangar flying session on Saturday night out at the airport, have some beers with some buddies, and see who comes up with the best ideas for thinking outside the box when you have things go wrong. What can you do to fly the airplane? What can you do to communicate? What can you do to remedy situations that you may not immediately think of or may not be listed in your POH? Always try to think of a scenario before it happens. Now, this doesn't mean that you're going to go up and think of 500 different scenarios while you're flying, because you're going to get distracted thinking about all those scenarios. But let's say you're coming down and you're at, coming through 3,000 feet, and you just happen to think about what happens right now if I were to blow a tire on landing. And you run that little scenario through your head in about 10 or 15 seconds, and you land totally uneventfully, nothing happens, tires are fine. And then maybe 10 flights later, you land, and all out of a sudden out of the blue, tire blows out. You're going to be a little bit more ready to handle that scenario because you had previously thought about it. So think about some scenarios on the ground or when you're bored in cruise flight. And then one day when they do happen, you'll be a little bit more prepared to handle them. That's another fun thing to do when you're hangar flying, when the weather's bad and you're just having a few beers at the airport. Next, mitigate your risks. How do you mitigate your risks? Well, it really depends on what kind of risk you're talking about. It could be bringing 2 kids on board the airplane and bringing an extra adult to watch them so they don't become a risk while you're flying. It could be have the A&P give your airplane a good once-over before you take it on a trip over to the Bahamas. It could be choose another day that the weather's a little bit better to go fly. Those sorts of things all mitigate your risk. Make sure you're mitigating as many of your risks as possible. Flying's always going to be risky, but mitigate as much as you can. If you got more questions about risks and mitigating them, take a look at our video about the risk matrix. It's pretty neat about how to evaluate where those risks fall, how risky they really are. Lastly, ask questions. Talk it out and talk it out concisely. If you're flying and there's other people in the airplane and there's no conversation happening, then you're not really using CRM to the best of your ability. Make sure you're asking questions to your passengers, to the other pilot. Talk it out. So say you're flying with another pilot and you're coming down, you're flying along the downwind, and you're going to delay dropping the gear for some reason. Tell him that. If you're used to dropping the gear midfield downwind, tell him, hey, I'm delaying the gear drop until, we're on base. That way, you get on base and you're in such a habit of dropping it on midfield downwind and you forget, he'll remind you because now it's clued him into the fact that you're delaying it and he can pay more attention to that fact. If you have a passenger that's not familiar with aviation whatsoever, just tell them, hey, when we fly over the big pond or when we fly over the water tower, you're going to hear a big bump as the gear comes down. And then, if they don't hear that bump, they may ask you about it, and you may go, oh my gosh, I forgot to drop the landing gear. So use those resources, talk to people, ask questions, and make sure you're being concise when you do so. Don't go on a long tangent, but when you want to do things out of the ordinary, or when you are just doing things normal per SOP, make sure you're talking out and verbalizing things, and someone else on the airplane may help you find something that you're missing or have a better idea than you and help you ultimately make a better decision. So that's all I've got for you on CRM today. We have a whole nother video about single pilot resource management, SRM. And if you have any questions on this, I know we could talk about this for hours, but if you have any questions or comments, please leave them in the comments below on this video. I'd be happy to talk about it again. And make sure you give us a thumbs up, like the video, subscribe to our channel to keep up with our latest episodes as they come out every week. Make sure you check out our Patreon page. We really appreciate y'all's support, and it's really crucial that we have that support to continue making these videos and continue funding our website. Be sure to share us with your friends on Facebook and around the airport. And as always, if you can't fly every day, then fly at MikeElf.com. We'll see y'all next time.